On today's Locked On Jayhawks, Kansas comes in at number 13 of the 14-team conference in the defensive rankings on the Locked On preseason poll. Is that accurate? What would that mean for Kansas if it happens? And what happens if they can just be a league average defense? Discussing that on today's edition of the show.
You are Locked On Jayhawks, your daily podcast on the Kansas Jayhawks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Well, Monday through Friday from 3 to 6 p.m. on KLWN in Lawrence with Rock Chalk Sports Talk. And obviously you can tune in to our show here with Locked On Jayhawks. Be an everydayer. Join us every day here. And you can find us wherever you get any of your podcasts. You can also find us on our YouTube page with Locked On Jayhawks. Like and subscribe to the show. You can follow on Twitter if you like it, Twitter. On today's edition of the show, we're talking the Kansas defense. We talked about the KU offense on Monday's edition of the show. Here today, we're talking the Kansas defense. And obviously, not thought of as highly in the Big 12 in the preseason poll, which we're going to talk about right now. So preseason poll in the Locked On poll, whatever you want to call it, Iowa State, number one defense. They had the number one defense last year. Makes sense. Obviously, they lose Will McDonald, which will be a big loss for them, but they've consistently had a great defense here over the last handful of years. Texas in at number two. That's been a defense that's been kind of up and down year to year, but they have a ton of talent back on the defense. Last year, they made a lot of strides for a really good defense. Baylor in at number three. They took a bit of a step back last year from where they were the year before, but Dave Aranda is such a good defensive coach. You figure they're going to figure it out even without Siaki Ika, who I think was one of the best defensive players in the conference. Number four is Oklahoma, which they were one of the worst defenses in the conference last year. So that's, I think, a talent thing and a transfer portal thing and a Brent Venables thing, trusting that in year two, a very complicated system that he starts to figure it out. Kansas State is in at number five. I would be comfortable putting Kansas State up even higher on this list, but, definitely top five. Oklahoma State in at number six, Cincinnati in at number seven. I mean, if they're the same defense they were the past couple of years, they could be even higher, but they've lost a lot of players with the coaching change. BYU is in at number eight. Texas Tech is ninth. West Virginia is 10th. TCU 11th. UCF 12th. Kansas comes in at number 13, and Houston, the only defense lower than them, in at number 14. And when I'm looking through these rankings, I do think, to me, like, Iowa State is probably pretty clearly the preseason number one pick, but, I'd be fine, honestly, if even Texas were up there. Baylor, I get the coach trust thing. I don't know how much of a difference there is between, I guess, maybe even like 1 through 5, though, on this list. And then I don't know how much of a difference there is really between, like, maybe even 6 through the rest. I don't know, 6 through like 9. But then like 10 through 14, I don't think there's really much separation. Like, West Virginia really struggled defensively last year. They're number 10 this year, and they lost Dante Stills, who was a really good defensive tackle for them. Like, I don't know that there's that much of a difference there between them and say Kansas and Houston at 13 and 14. Kansas and trying to look up the rankings here. I do think TCU at 11th. I'm expecting them to be better than that. Probably expecting UCF at 12th to be better than that. I could see, but we'll wait and see. Now, as far as what this means for Kansas, though, this is about what you'd expect. I've come on here. We had Jalen Daniels in at like the number 4 quarterback, KU offense in at number 4, and I told you why you could argue those could be higher, even though those were like not, they weren't disrespectful rankings. They were, they were fine. I would have had them higher, but they're fine. The defense, though, it's harder to have that argument for when you look at what they produced in the statistics, right? Now, you can make cases about this guy improving, that guy improving, and we'll get to that, or ways that they can make that jump up and how important it would be for them to do that. But, can you at least like jump over West Virginia or Texas Tech, who's in at like 9th and 10th in the preseason rankings? How high can you rise with this defense? Like, what is the ceiling? What is the floor? The floor of this defense is being one of these bottom 2 defenses in the Big 12, as we've seen the past couple of years. The ceiling, though, like I said, I don't know, man. Like Oklahoma State had some troubles on defense. Maybe we don't want to target them though, or Cincinnati, who's been, but I don't know. Cincinnati, even though they have a couple really good defensive linemen back and players in the front seven, lose a lot from the transfer portal and graduation in the NFL drafters, especially leaving and how having a new defensive scheme. Like maybe the ceiling for this defense is a middle pack, number 7, number 8. I know that doesn't sound like a lot, but that would be a big improvement for this team from where they were in years past. And going back to something we talked about with the offense, or on Monday's show, we said with the offense, if this offense ends up being the number one offense in the Big 12, the last decade of number one offenses in the Big 12, 6 of the 10 had bottom half defenses in the Big 12 and still won at least 10 games in every year but one, which was the COVID year where the team went 9-2. So if you can have as good of an offense as you think, if you just become a league average defense, that's how you legitimately become a 10-win team, a Big 12 title contender. Now, out of comparison, Texas Tech gave up the most points per game in the country last year. And that was with Tyreek Wilson, who was, top 10 pick, unbelievable player, freak athlete. West Virginia was 116th in the country in points allowed per game last season. So West Virginia being picked 10th, Texas Tech being picked 9th, if you can get above them, that kind of puts you in that middle tier of the conference. That seems doable to me, right? So I don't think the gap is that large for KU to make up to be maybe that 8th, 9th, 10th best defense in the league, which if they do, and if you do even have the number one offense, or even if you have the 3rd or 4th, like their predicted best offense, that's how you could win 7 or 8 games with then the potential for, if you move in higher, to the higher range of that. But that's how you end up with the over. That's how you end up improving from last year's team. The defense is going to have to get better as a part of that. How likely is that? Can they do it? What's it going to take to get there? And what happens if they don't get there? What happens if they do get better and it actually gets worse? Even you lost your best defensive player last year in Lonnie Phelps. We're going to discuss that coming up here in a minute with Locked On Jayhawks. First, though, this episode of the show is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Take your first swing at betting MLB on FanDuel and get 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets up to $200. That's right. Just bet $20 and you'll land $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. That's $200 you can spend betting everything from the money line to the over-under to who you think is going to hit the first home run, or bet on some of these win totals in college football, the over-under win totals on different teams. Get some futures if you think somebody's going to win a different conference. Maybe bet on the Heisman, all on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Plus, when you win, you get paid instantly. There's no better place to bet on MLB than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So sign up today and visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get up to $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, an official partner of Major League Baseball. Moving on here with Locked On Jayhawks, more about the defense. How much better can they get? Can they become a middle of the pack defense in the league? And then we'll finish up with what if the defense doesn't get better. By the way, on our next episode of Locked On, we're going to KU basketball. There's been a lot of talk about KU basketball. Do they have enough 3-point shooting? I'm going to dive into, they might actually have enough and where that level they need to get to and how that could be accomplished. But finishing up with the defensive stuff on today's edition of the show. What if they can get to the middle of the pack? If you have a top 2 or 3 offense in the league, then I think you're looking at, if you're a middle of the pack defense, you are looking at 7 to 9 wins. We did that discussion the other day. If you have the number 1 defense or the number 1 offense, and then you just have the 8th best defense, that's probably a 10-win team. Now, if you end up with let's say the 4th to 6th best offense in the Big 12, and you end up with a middle of the pack defense, it's still probably 7 wins, 6-7 wins, right? Which is going to be good enough to get you to a bowl game. Pretty much if you can become a league average defense or right around there, 7th, 8th, 9th best defense in the league, your floor basically becomes, because we know what the offense is going to be in range of, your floor basically becomes a bowl team. And your ceiling becomes a Big 12 title contender. based on the variance of, is it the best offense or is it a top 5 offense? That's what happens if you just become a middle of the pack defense in the Big 12. And as we mentioned, the distance for what you have to jump in the gap, it's not as much as you'd think. They did still, as much as the defense struggled last year, giving up 35 points per game, which, was last in the Big 12. They still did improve by, 6 points or so per game in what they were doing from the year before. So they did get a lot better. They do deserve credit for that. And if you can stay on that same, arrow pointed up and improve by another 4, 5, 6 points per game, that's going to be enough. Now, how would that happen? How would KU have to do that? Well, first of all, KU really struggled on third down defense. They also really struggled on fourth down defense. Can you get off the field more in those critical moments? KU wasn't a bad team at turnover plus minus. They ended up, I think, +2 or +3 on the season in their turnover differential. Can you force even more turnovers, though? That's another avenue for this to jump up. Can you have a really good turnover forcing season for KU? Right there's an avenue right there. Now, part of the struggles on third and fourth down aren't just, they got unlucky or they didn't have the right scheme or they weren't making plays on third and fourth down. Now, there's some of that, maybe they weren't making the good enough play, the winning play on that third or fourth down. But part of that, too, is that a lot of those third and fourth downs for Kansas were 3rd and 2, 3rd and 3, 3rd and 4 for the opposing offense versus the KU defense. So, of course, they're going to convert a lot of those. Of course, you're going to convert more of the 4th and 1s than you are 4th and 4s, right? So part of that is just doing better on 1st and 2nd down. And the biggest part of that to me is the run defense. KU was abhorrent against the run in 2021. And then last year in 2020, got a lot better. But then it faded as the season went on. You look at the first, few games of the season. They were great against Tennessee Tech, as you'd expect. West Virginia game, that was a West Virginia offense that had a couple good running backs and ran really well against Pittsburgh the game before, and you did a solid enough job against them. You did a solid enough job against Houston and Duke running the ball. Like, TCU was fine running the ball, but it wasn't like 5 or 3. They were still in the 4 range, right? You were fine in a lot of these games. And then the Oklahoma game happened, and they just ripped you apart on the ground. And from then on, it felt like that was the case. Like, whether it was, the Baylor game, the Arkansas game, where you just could not stop the run. It was just a sieve through your defense, right? And so that's the biggest difference for me. If you can be a solid run defense team, you're going to wind up in more 3rd and 6, 3rd and 7s. And so we can talk about the pass rush, which is a real conversation. You lost your best player on your defense, Lonnie Phelps. The year before you had Kyron Johnson, gave you 6.5 sacks. Last year you had Lonnie Phelps, gave you 7.5 sacks. You weren't a great pass rush team overall, but you had that one guy. What are you going to do if you don't have that guy? And to be clear, Jeremy Robinson could be that guy. I am high on Jeremy Robinson breaking out. I think Jeremy Robinson's a really good player, end up being that guy. But let's go in the hypothetical where you don't end up pass rusher, where you don't have that, all Big 12 type level of pass rush. You can make up for it by being a good run defense, because if you are in 3rd and 6, 3rd and 7 more than you are 3rd and 4, 3rd and 3, well, even if the pass rush isn't as talented, they're going to know more likely it is a pass. They're going to be able to get that extra jump. They're going to be able to pin their ears back and head for the quarterback, because they're going to know it's a more one-dimensional type play that the offense is running. And that's going to help you out in a lot of ways. You're going to be able to run more blitzes if it's 3rd and 6, 3rd and 7. You're going to be able to disguise more coverages or do other things with your secondary, different types of zones, because you're expecting a pass than a certain defense where you might have to be like, yeah, but they might run the ball here. It's 3rd and 3, right? Just being a good run defense on 1st and 2nd down, that really is the key to me to this team becoming a middle pack of defense. Either that or just the turnover thing, which I don't know if you want to bank on that. That might be more of a luck thing. It might be more of a stress thing, whatever it is. If you can do one of those two things, that's the way I view it. Now, I guess there's another world out there. What if the KU secondary is just so dominant? What if they're locked down that it allows you to basically put guys on islands and basically blitz a lot and, put a lot of pressure at your backers up top to stop the run and to blitz and attack the quarterback? Maybe that's something you can do. as talented and good as a lot of the players in the KU secondary are, and I do expect them to be better than they were last year when they already showed a lot of good flashes, they still were 8th of the 10 teams in the Big 12 last year in passing yards allowed per pass, right? So, yes, not all of that is on the DBs. Some of it is on the pass rush, but if we're talking about the pass rush not being there, or I guess part of it too is, yeah, if you have 3rd and 7, it's going to be more predictable than 3rd and 4. But I mean, as talented as these DBs are, basically what I'm saying, if you end up 5th in yards allowed per pass, that's not going to be locked down enough that it's going to allow everything else to just be like, oh, we don't even have to worry about that. No, that's not going to be the case. So I think realistically, those are the 2 avenues for if you can do it. Just be better run defense team, especially on 1st and 2nd down. That's the big one right there. Otherwise, just be a turnover forcing defense and get the ball back for your offense. And if you can do one of those 2 things, or even both those things, you'll probably be a middle of the pack defense in the Big 12. And, I think that's enough for this team to surpass their win total from last year and or have a special season. All right, we're going to finish things up. What happens if it doesn't get better, though? What happens if the Kansas defense stays as being one of the bottom defenses in the Big 12? Finishing things up with Locked On Jayhawks. We've talked a lot about the optimism, and I think there are reasons to be optimistic. Obviously, you do look at, having all these starters back, right? You look at having your starting linebackers back with Craig Young, Rich Miller, Tywan Berryhill. You look at having all your starting DBs back. You're looking at having, starting depth back in the secondary with Kalen Gervin, and, you have 3 safeties with Marvin Grant, Kenny Logan, OJ Burrows. You look at guys who maybe redshirted or were depth, or, you hear about maybe breaking out like Brian Dilworths of the world, or Jermaine Dye or Jalen Dye, Jalen Dyes of the world. You look at having some starting level defensive linemen back, or guys who have at least rotated in that could break out, like Jeremy Robinson. You look at the transfer portal additions, JB Brown. I'm excited to see what he can do. You look at the 2 Minnesota guys with Keys and Booker, right? You look at Devin Phillips, what he could bring to the interior of the D line and slowing down the run. There's a lot of reasons to be optimistic, especially with another year in a system of Brian Borland, that they can get better and that they should be better, because the bar was a little bit lower there. And they did show some flashes. I mean, remember the first half of the TCU game last year when you gave up 10 points? Honestly, giving up 38 points to TCU, I know it looks bad because, the second half was 28. Maybe they had figured you out, but Michigan gave up 50 something to TCU. You actually held TCU below their season average. So, there were the Iowa State games where you look at it and it was like, okay, they showed some flashes for you here. But there is an avenue where, what if it doesn't get better? You can also view this from a standpoint of, you lost a bunch of defensive linemen, right? Whether it's your veteran guys like Sam Burt or Lonnie Phelps. You lost your best defensive player at a position that, you could argue pass rush is the most important position on a defense. How are you going to get better from that, right? We saw the transfer linebacker thing not really work out a ton last year, like it did for Craig Young, but, not really for some of the other guys, right? So what is that going to mean for JB Brown? What if the linebacking core just is what it is and it doesn't get better? What if the DBs are fine enough? What if they're solid, but it's not a dominant unit? What if the defense just doesn't really get better? It would put a ton of pressure on the offense at that point. Basically, if this happens, if this does end up being a bottom 2 or 3 defense in the Big 12, Kansas pretty much has to have a top 2 or 3 offense in the Big 12 just to probably bowl eligible. And then at that point, if you do have a bottom 2 or 3 defense in the league, your ceiling probably becomes like a 7-win team at that point, right? I mean, it drastically lowers, unless you have the number 1 offense, to which your ceiling still might only be 7 or 8 wins. And I think there is one unspoken key here that will matter, is the special teams as well, because I guess if you do have a bottom 2 or 3 defense, but you have a top 2 or 3 offense and you have a top 5 special teams, maybe that still is enough to win 7 or 8 games. But again, the defense thing kind of lowers the ceiling here, and it even lowers the floor, right? I mean, if you have a bottom 2 or 3 defense and for whatever reason the offense isn't clicking, or there's a key injury or 2, or teams have figured out the option game and Kansas can't really go to that and they have to go to more base stuff, maybe that is how this team turns into a 4 or 5 win team. What happens if the defense gets worse, right? Like, what happens if they take a step back to not where they were in 2022, but they take a step to where they were in 2021? I guess in this scenario, and going back to special teams too, I think it matters too, in being able to pin your team deep with the punter. Like, how good is Damon Greaves going to be, the punter from Australia, right? And how important is this season for Brian Borland, right? I do think that, I was thinking about this the other night. Obviously, it hasn't come around as quickly for Brian Borland with the defense that it has with Andy Kotelnicki in the offense. You go back and you look at the Buffalo teams, Brian Borland had really good defenses with Buffalo. And it's different being in the MAC than it is in the Big 12, obviously. But, I do think Brian Borland should be given some patience when you look at the cupboards were pretty darn full for Andy Kotelnicki. Like, Andy Kotelnicki has done an unbelievable job. He's an unbelievable tactician. I'm not trying to take away from that by saying you have good players. Well, obviously, to, put up good numbers, you have to have a good scheme and good players, right? But the cupboard was left pretty full for Andy Kotelnicki. You had Jalen Daniels. Like, okay, that's very helpful. You had Devin Neal already in tow when you came in. Like, all these receivers, like Lawrence Arnold was Les Miles guy, Luke Grimm, all that sort of stuff, right? You had a full cupboard when you got here. Brian Borland, think about a lot of what's on their defense. Like Kenny Logan was here. Kobe Bryant was here. But, you basically had to remake the entire linebacking group yourself. You basically had to remake most of the defensive line yourself at this point. So, like, you've mostly had to make up the depth of the defense. You had, like, no depth when you took over yourself. So the cupboard wasn't as full. So you should be patient with it. And I know Lance Leipold and the staff is and everything, but I don't know. How warm is that seat headed into this year? If you end up with a worse defense than you did the year before, what ends up happening there? And I don't hope that to be the case, and I don't want that to be the case, and I don't think it will be the case. I'm expecting improvement moving forward. And like I said, I think you should be patient with Brian Borland, right? I think there's reason to expect it to get better, and there are those reasons that it was going to be a longer process. And it's almost like because of how good Andy Kotelnicki was, it puts more pressure on it. I'm just saying be patient with it. But yeah, I mean, there is a lot of pressure on the KU defense to try to just get a little bit better. Just try to be a middle of the pack defense in the Big 12. But if you can, special things could be in store for the season. That's going to do it for this episode of Locked On Jayhawks. You can find us wherever you get any of your podcasts. Thank you to all the everydayers out there. Hit me up on Twitter at DJohnsonRadio if you got a question, something you want us to talk about here on the show. You can also find us on our YouTube page with Locked On Jayhawks, like in the show. Friday, we talk some KU basketball. Does KU have enough three-point shooting to win the title this upcoming season? I'm Derek Johnson. Have a good rest of your day. This has been Locked On Jayhawks.